This place is like super duper creep town, right?
This is right where my dad came face to face with Frank Stone.
I think you're starting to see what we're up against.
Your call, Chris.
I've sacrificed everything searching for it.
I don't know what I expected, but it wasn't
A
this.
world within a story.
You're not okay, are you?
I'm sleepwalking through a nightmare and I just can't seem to wake up.
That is Frank Stone.
I am Augustine Lieber.
All distracted.
And I'm about to change our worlds. Forever.
Hey everyone, it's Soul here, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Those of you that have seen my previous videos before or have popped on over to my live streams, you guys will know that I love Supermassive games. It's really the only video game studio that I keep close tabs on. I adored Until Dawn, and I love the unique and fun stories that they are constantly creating within the Dark Pictures anthology. I think their gameplay format is really fun and enjoyable and works really well, so despite all of my nitpicky comments about pacing and the characters, I genuinely love their work, and I'm always looking forward to seeing what sort of stories they are creating. So it's no surprise that I, like many others of you out there, was really looking forward to the release of the casting of Frank Stone. I think I mentioned it in nearly every single one of my live streams for the past 3 months because I was just so excited about it. So when it finally came out in the beginning of September and I finally sat down to play it, I hate to say that I just didn't like it. The game sadly felt a bit sloppy, a bit rushed. It had some major pacing issues where it sort of dragged in the middle really badly, and we were left with a lot of unanswered questions by the end of the game. And even after playing through it a second time and seeing multiple different other Let's Plays and endings and possibilities, there's still so many questions that lingered, and I just still, at the end of this, find myself feeling disappointed in this game. So let's discuss where I feel the Dead by Daylight and Supermassive collaboration of the casting of Frank Stone went wrong. As always, make sure to hit that like button, click subscribe to see more videos from me, and leave a comment down below. This is actually the first video of Spooktober, the month of October. We are doing extra live streams, extra analysis videos, so if you are interested in that, be sure to stick around. I also just recently started a Twitch channel, so if you like to watch live streams over on Twitch instead of YouTube, make sure to go give me a quick follow over there. So here is your one and only warning, that this video contains spoilers. Alright, grab your friends, wind up that camera, and let's hang out. The casting of Frank Stone is a single-player interactive horror game developed by Supermassive Games and published by Behavior Interactive. In it, we get to play as a few different characters across 3 different nights, taking place in 3 different years. We go on to try and keep all of our characters alive through their respective horrific evenings. We start off the game following Sam Green in 1963 as he arrives at the Cedar Steel Mill in search for a missing baby. Once inside, Officer Green ends up finding Frank Stone right as he is about to sacrifice this kid, and so we as players go on to try and fight to rescue the baby. More often than not, we are successful and we end up killing Frank Stone in the process, which goes on to actually disturb the ritual that is occurring under the seeing eye of this ominous woman by the name of Augustine Lieber. With the events of 1963 serving as the prologue, we then get to go on to meet our characters for both the 1980 and 2024 evenings. These 2 nights will alternate for the rest of the game, however, for the ease of explanation, we will talk about them separately. In 1980, we get to see a group of friends consisting of Chris, Jaime, and Linda, who are trying to film a horror movie they created by the name of Murder Mill, where they film at the local abandoned steel mill. With Sam Green arriving at the steel mill, causing them to drop and break their camera, he goes on to forbid them from filming at the steel mill anymore. So, like all moody teenagers do, they end up finding a way to sneak back in the middle of the night with help from Jaime's sister Bonnie, who ends up paying for their new camera that they buy from this mysterious lady at the curiosity shop, and with help from Sam's son Robert, who shows them a secret way into the mill. As they sneak in to film their movie in the middle of the night, it is then that the spirit of Frank Stone begins to awake and begins to attack the group. It turns out that the camera attracts these particles and pieces of him left behind, summoning him from his death. With Frank Stone only being visible through the camera's lens, you have to try and keep our characters alive as they are separated, with Chris even being teleported and transported into the events of 2024, but more on that brief detour a bit later on. Once the group is finally reunited, they are attacked and confronted once more by Frank Stone, in which Bonnie is killed by Frank, before Sam Green finally comes to the rescue and helps fight Frank by trapping him within the camera's mysterious film. The group then cut up each piece of film, going on to hold on to it for the rest of their lives in an attempt to never let it get joined together and never let the spirit of Frank Stone get released.
What do we do with it?
We separate it. We each take a piece. Then we take them as far away from each other as we possibly can, and we never let them come back together again.
Meanwhile, in the events of 2024, we closely follow the events of Madison, Bonnie's daughter, as she's been invited to this mysterious mansion on invitation from Augustine Lieber. We learn that Bonnie has recently died as Maddie is suffering from nightmares over the loss and grief of her mother. On the way to the mansion, we meet an older version of Linda and a man named Stan before Augustine reveals the reason they are all there. She is trying to buy their respective pieces of film for Murder Mill, the very movie that we see being filmed in 1980s by Linda and her friends. In Augustine's absence, these three strangers get to explore the mysterious mansion full of items that are related to death and, more importantly, related to Murder Mill. The trio is then suddenly attacked by Sam Green, who is seemingly the same age as Linda, despite the fact that we know he should be much older than her. Talking even more with Sam, Linda begins to question the events of their evening, while Maddie and Stan, who had left the room earlier on, go on to encounter Chris, who is coming through this weird teleportation dimensional travel device that we eventually learn is called the Horologium. Chris had just been attacked by Frank Stone and sucked into this sort of portal before she ends up waking up here in front of both Maddie and Stan. Now, while Chris can stay in the events of 2024, aside from a few fun theories and maybe the one secret ending with her going back to the past, not much changes or actually benefits the overall story with her staying here. So for that reason, we will just send her back in this overview. So while Maddie and Stan tried to manage how to work this Horologium to send Chris back to the 80s, Linda stumbles upon Augustine's secret archives, where she discovers that Augustine is collecting every single piece of this film that ever existed in not only Linda's timeline and world, but in every single possible dimension that this film ever existed in. With everyone meeting up in one room, we see that Linda still doesn't trust Sam, especially if you have her choose to read his confusing journal that talks about this travel between the different dimensions. Before they can figure things out though, the film begins to play and the group realizes that Augustine stole their tapes. Frank Stone's spirit, Augustine's key to completing this ritual and releasing the entity, walks through the film as he usually goes on to kill Stan, but it can also be Sam or Chris, allowing this bridge between the worlds to be complete as the entity emerges into their world. As you escape the mansion, it's soon revealed that the survivors get trapped in the endless loop of the entity's game as our survivors find themselves waiting at a campfire, which is of course the lobby for Dead by Daylight. My initial reaction to this ending was just not good, so before I dive in and dissect all of the negatives, let's first discuss the few positives that this game has to offer. This collaboration did bring around some fun and new quick times, which I always love to see. With Supermassive's repetitive format, it's always nice to see them try different quick times to sort of shake things up a little bit, so the additions of the generators, the new types of puzzles, and the different quick times was really nicely done. I also really want to give them credit where credit is due. With the addition of the Twitch integration, I think that was a really cool feature to add, especially for all the live streamers to be able to see their chats vote. I think it made for a really cool integration of the fans. The cutting room floor is also really impressive. I love being able to see everything mapped out like this branching spider web. I think that's so cool. And in every single one of Supermassive's games, they're always improving this cutting room floor feature. The soundtrack for this game is also pretty nicely done. It gets tense when it's supposed to, and it creates an overall good ambiance. However, that's really where my praise for this game sort of stops. There's a lot of other things in this game that I liked in the beginning that I feel sadly got ruined or hindered in the later half of the game. So with that, let's begin our analysis of the negatives. The initial setup and premise for this game is something that I really like that just was not executed well enough. I like the idea of taking the Supermassive format and switching it up by having the use of time travel and different dimensions at play. I think we saw this sort of first glimpse in Little Hope where they tested this out, so seeing this game where time travel and dimensional travel is so crucial to the overall story and plot, it got me really excited, which is why I find myself so disappointed that at the end of it, it feels very sloppily written and very rushed. The fact that we have so many questions remaining at the end of this game is so disappointing. I also just don't like that this game was made with next to no regard for non-Dead by Daylight players, despite them advertising this as an introduction to the world and lore for everyone to come and play. I know there's going to be people in the comments saying that this game is not made for you because you did not play Dead by Daylight. However, I would strongly beg to differ. Whenever companies do a collaboration, the whole goal is to bring in both fandoms so that they can then hopefully transfer over to the opposite game. Supermassive wants the Dead by Daylight players to fall in love with their format so that they then go on to play perhaps the Dark Pictures anthology. And the same goes for Dead by Daylight players. They want to intrigue Supermassive fans to fall in love with the lore so that they go on to play Dead by Daylight. It is supposed to be mutually beneficial to both sides of this collaboration. So while I can completely understand, and I knew going into this that I was not going to understand every single Easter egg and every single little detail in every single news article, I didn't expect the Dead by Daylight lore from the previous games to be so crucial in our understanding of the narrative events and story of the casting of Frank Stone. And yes, I am talking about that interdimensional travel that is so crucial to this story, because when I first played through this game, all I could think of was time travel. All I saw was Sam Green jumping around through the different timelines in order to help out and maybe try and stop Augustine. I didn't understand that there was different dimensions in different worlds until the game directly stated it, pulling the oh so annoying telling us something instead of showing us. It was also really hard to suddenly switch my theories and thoughts from time travel over to interdimensional travel, since it's not really explained or expanded upon outside of our initial clues that let us know it's dimensional travel. The first time that we truly get any sort of solid clue about it being different dimensions is when Sam drops his line about not breaking Linda's camera.
But knowing what I know now, I'm glad I broke your camera.
But you never broke our camera.
Well, of course I...
That is the very first time that I started to get confused. Now, yes, the archive section does help clarify things just a little bit, especially when we go on to get Augustine directly talking about shadow worlds and shadow selves.
For every path taken, there exists another, taken by a shadow self. Another reality. Another world. Worlds so close, they bleed together. Do you see? The timelines I chose were special. The bleed strong. The entity straining against the edges of our world.
But again, the pacing and the timing of these reveals were too late in the game for me to get a solid hold of everything that was going on before we had this sort of last-minute showdown, if you could really even call it a showdown rather than a mad dash to escape. Point being, I was left a bit lost before the game suddenly seemed to end. Since the pacing of this game is a huge reason as to why I feel like this game is not good, let's just take a few minutes to look at it a bit closer. I really think that this game messed up the exact timing and therefore the overall pacing of the gigantic reveal of the interdimensional travel. I honestly feel like if it was earlier in the game, I think it would be better. Supermassive Games is sadly starting to fall into this pattern of poorly executed twists that they try so badly to hold on to until the very end of the game, simply to have that little haha got you type of moment. But I really don't think this was the right decision at all. When looking at the whole story of the casting of Frank Stone, it takes place across about 6.5 hours, give or take some time, based on the average length of the Let's Plays I've been seeing online. Now, Frank Stone himself, he doesn't appear until just after the midway point of the game. So that whole first half, our introductions to the 1980s and 2024 timeline, that setup that they go through tends to drag out for way too long. We don't feel any sort of action or threat because our main enemy and presence has not appeared yet. And then in the 2024 timeline, the trio has just been walking around the same time that the 1980s group is just wandering around filming things. But then, finally, Frank Stone appears, the 80s group has some conflict, has some pressure on them, has some threat for their lives. But the 2024 timeline still has that slow, dragging feeling. There's still nothing going on for them. So every time something exciting happens in the 80s and you want to stay with those characters, the game will suddenly cut away to the 2024 timeline. It also goes to note here that after Frank Stone initially appears and manifests for the group, we do have a little bit of a slow period in the 80s because we get to follow Linda in the basements where she's all on her own. In both of our timelines, there is no threat, and without a threat, there is no strong tension to sort of drive the energy of this story along. Yes, I do know that Augustine is our main enemy here, but the reality is, she works in the shadows and she is not an active presence to pressure the characters in our story. And this is why I genuinely think that moving up this crucial plot twist to earlier in the story would have been really helpful and would help cover a lot of these low points in the game. Having the characters directly learn about this instead of it being sort of narrated by Augustine to us as players, I think would help elevate the story, and at the very least, it would have raised the stakes and raised the tension amongst the characters. And I'm not just pointing out all of these issues with the reveal of interdimensional travel because I missed it. I'm pointing it out because it's bad writing. The reality is, even if you played Dead by Daylight and you knew about the interdimensional travel that is going on in this story, the characters themselves never have this moment of realization. The characters themselves never realize what exactly is happening, and because of that, we don't get any sort of character development or conflict or any sort of tension from this type of realization. Just imagine the arguments and issues that could occur between our 5 people in the 2024 events if they found out what exactly is at play here. So even though, yes, Supermassive did leave us some clues to give us suggestions of this interdimensional travel a bit earlier, the main example I'm thinking of is if you fail to save the baby in the prologue, Sam Green, when talking to Linda, will talk about how he failed to save Jaime. It is revealed that Jaime was the child that Frank Stone tried to kill in the 60s.
The time I ever saw you even close to this intense was when you caught Chris and Jaime and me at the mill.
Jaime?
Yeah, Jaime.
He was one of your buddies.
You're not okay, are you?
Sure I am.
He was my best friend. You can remember me, but you can't remember Jaime Rivera?
However, even if you find out these things, the point still remains that the characters themselves in the present-day 2024 timeline and even in the 80s never have this moment of realization, and it strips the story of a lot of nuance and complexity in relation to these characters. Moving on to other things that I feel this story was lacking, I think this story lacked an overall amount of action. Now, because we get the initial action and fight and confrontational moment with Sam fighting Frank Stone in the beginning, I think I was prepared for a lot more sort of hand-to-hand combat, a lot more quick times, but then by the end of the game, you're basically just walking as your grand finale in the 80s when you play as Sam Green, versus running out of the mansion and just avoiding all sort of fights and conflicts when you're playing as Maddie and or Linda. Now, I know that both timelines do not end in some sort of victory after a fight against Frank. Both timelines, they do eventually kind of end in this bad sort of ending. However, I can't help but feel like there should have been way more action at the end. Having the 1980s version end with Sam Green just walking around with the camera was really lackluster. I also feel like the camera itself was not used to its fullest effect. I think the way that the game sectioned off the areas that you could actually raise the camera made it 10 times less scary than it could have been. If we had access and could raise the camera multiple times throughout the game and it wasn't just reserved for moments that Frank Stone was definitely going to appear, then I actually think this would help add in a bit more tension and raise the stakes for the overall story and pacing. However, the fact of the matter is they didn't do that. The camera would spark when you're getting close to Frank Stone, and you could only raise it during certain sections. So the amount of fear that I felt from the overall threat of Frank Stone was not nearly as high enough to make up for the fact that we were missing an enemy in the first half of the game. Add this dull camera effect back into the fact that they avoid action at any cost, and they are always cutting away when something crazy happens in one timeline. For example, cutting away back to 2024 after Bonnie is killed, only to then return to the 80s when they've already been captured. We don't even get a cutscene of them fighting Frank Stone or seeing Frank drag them down into the tunnels. So when you add all of this together, there's really no tension or threat to help drive this energy forward. Now, if they were to do this sort of cutaway maybe once or twice in the entire game, I think then it could work really well as a sort of dramatic pause in the storytelling. However, since they do it every single time something interesting happens, it just ends up bringing the overall energy and pacing of the story down, creating that dragging feeling throughout much of the game. So with all of this lack of action, lack of conflict and confrontation, with the lack of details and expansion on the lore of the interdimensional travel, and the overall poor pacing, let's try and find out some more information by taking a closer look at each and every one of the characters. The main trio at the mansion have very two-dimensional characters. You have a morally good, a morally bad, and a sort of morally neutral. Obviously, Maddie cares about everyone, Stan cares only about himself, and Linda is somewhere in the middle. But none of them actually have any sort of character developments or interesting changes. Maddie is obviously our main character for the 2024 timeline. However, aside from her just being this really nice and bubbly type of personality, we don't end up getting any sort of expansion on her struggles with grief after the loss of her mother Bonnie.
I was talking to my mom, to Bonnie. I've just felt so, empty since she died. Like I'm sleepwalking through a nightmare and I just can't seem to wake up.
And we don't get any sort of conflicting conversations between her and Linda. Despite the game giving us an inkling that this might cause problems if you choose not to comfort Maddie, nothing actually changes between their relationship dynamic. They seem to always be friends no matter what you do. And this is the same situation between Linda and Sam. Nothing really happens between them, despite the idea that Sam doesn't really trust Linda. Linda will always not really trust Sam. There's nothing you can really do to make these two characters truly trust each other. Which is interesting because Linda is a pretty in-between character. She's a bit of a blank slate, not as much as the younger version of herself is that we see in the 80s, but she's still a pretty neutral character, so it would have been really nice to sort of have her personality change as we make decisions, since she's already starting pretty middle of the road. All three of these characters, they're okay, they do their job in telling the story, but I just would have wanted something a bit more, especially in the sense of the sort of butterfly effect relationship dynamics that don't really seem to be paying off in this game compared to other games done by Supermassive. As for our characters in the 80s, they do have a bit more of a complexity to them. I mean, we see that Chris is very self-centered and she always has her own interests up front, causing a bit of conflict and tension between her and Linda, especially in relation to her always insisting that she is the director and not Linda. It's a bit cheesy at times, but it's a nice touch and detail for her character. Another thing that adds a bit more of a complexity and depth to Chris is the idea that she has this moral grayness to her, since she's going around touching this crime scene. She knows she probably shouldn't, but she's doing it anyway because she finds it interesting and wants to use it in the film so badly. I like that this is so tied into her desires to be this perfect and amazing director. Then of course you have the bit of complexity coming about from her natural chemistry that we see occur with Robert, that goes on to create a conflict between her and Jaime's relationship. We see that Jaime is actually a very insecure character, as we go on to see that he is immediately jealous. We learn that Jaime never informed Chris that Robert is into horror movies, which is why there's naturally this bit of tension between the two of them, even before Robert is seen sort of flirting and talking with Chris. When looking at Robert's character, we don't actually get to know him too well. We instead learn a little bit more about him after the events of the 80s. We go on to learn that Robert kind of lost his mind. It's sort of implied that the events that occurred in the 80s went on to mess with his head forever, and it's interesting when you think about how he is the one that spent the least amount of time there. I would have really liked to learn more about Robert. I would have wanted to know a little bit more about his relationship with his father, which we do seem to get an insight to based on his few retellings of his dad telling him about the events at the mill. But that sort of dialogue really tells us more about Sam Green instead of Robert. And then there's Linda. Now, Linda is an interesting character because at the surface, she seems very passive. She doesn't really seem to speak up much, but at the same time, she doesn't necessarily back down from Chris. She insists on having her scene shot for the movie. She's the one kind of stepping up with the camera in that sort of final confrontation with Frank Stone. So she's definitely an interesting character, but her overall personality and presence in the story is still pretty weak, which I think is something that I wouldn't have wanted. I think I would have much rather spent a lot more time with more reactive characters like Chris and Bonnie and even Jaime. Speaking of Bonnie, I do think that she is an interesting character. She is really energetic, she's really reactive and emotional. She wears her emotions on her sleeve and often lashes out of anger. We see this right from the beginning, where she bursts into the garage in the middle of an argument with her father, and then we see this again as she tends to lash out against Jaime, or at the very least just get a bit more annoyed at him. The main example and point that I'm thinking of is after the scene, she begins to tear apart Jaime's acting performance because she feels, I guess, insulted that he is copying her own life for his story.
Sacrificing your own life for the good of your sibling and your parents definitely sounds familiar. Almost like it could even be based on someone we know, but gee, I wonder who.
That's not fair, Bonnie.
No one said it was.
We're trying to make something fun. I'm not trying to make everyone else miserable.
At least I'm not being selfish.
Selfish? Don't throw the lines back at me.
What? You don't want to tell me how noble it is that you're making this movie with your girlfriend while I had to scrub my entire life to take care of you and Dad?
I feel like that was a bit random. I do think that this sibling dynamic and relationship should have been explored more. However, with the story being so weirdly written, this is sort of glossed over and feels like a last-minute addition to the characters and their relationship, rather than a crucial element to the overall story. Nothing ever really happens. Jaime doesn't even seem to react to his sister getting killed in front of him. It all just seems very sloppily written, which is a shame because I did like Bonnie as a character. Moving on to Sam Green, he is arguably the main character throughout the entire game, since we start the game with him and we see him at the end of every single timeline. We do go on to learn that the 1963 version of Sam is the same Sam Green that we see in 2024, however, the Sam Green in 1980 is different. Now, it's through Sam Green that we actually learn the tiniest bit about the lore and how this sort of interdimensional travel works, and also a little bit more about the general lore for Dead by Daylight. We find this information in his diary that Linda can grab that you have to hit a quick time to in order to find. It's in these diary entries and this note that we learn Sam Green has joined an occult group by the name of the Imperiati. It's this group that directly tries to stop Augustine's occult group called the Black Veil, which is exactly why Sam has traveled from 1963 to this moment in 2024. If you are able to get this letter, Sam will then go on to try and explain the situation in a little bit more detail to Linda. However, this is about the full extent of the lore that we get. We don't really get much more lore in relation to Dead by Daylight. I can't help but feel like Sam Green should have been the one to clarify everything for all of the characters and for us as players, rather than to have Augustine share this sort of blank and cold, distant narration. I would have much rather seen Sam telling the group everything and to learn more about his experience. I think he's a really fascinating character, and I just can't help but feel like his whole character and personality and his knowledge is just a huge missed opportunity for the entire story. I mean, maybe if we are lucky, there will be some sort of sequel or prequel where we get to learn about Sam's experience joining this occult group and just get to know more about the entity and Augustine's powers and just more about these groups in general. However, I fear that we might never get that information. And then last but certainly not least, we have Augustine Lieber. She is the biggest mystery and the biggest remaining question at the end of the game. Who exactly is she, and why does she want to help the entity consume this world? Well, we don't really know. We don't even have a guess at all. We know for a fact that she is a member of the Black Veil, which is the occult group that worships the entity, but aside from that, we have no clue as to what her motives are. It's also really interesting to witness that Augustine is seemingly summoning another version of herself, or as she would probably put it, a shadow version of herself from a different dimension that she goes on to use as a sort of pawn in her plans in order to complete this ritual. I really wish that we got a lot more written information that we could find scattered around this mansion in relation to Augustine's plans and in relation to her own character. There was this moment when we were playing as Madison before we enter the Horologium that you are able to find her sort of altar to the entity. I wish that we could pick up one of these books and read information to get more info about either the lore of Dead by Daylight or the information about Augustine's character. I also just personally did not like how Augustine keeps narrating everything. I think the fact that she is kept at a distance really started to aggravate me, in combination with the fact that we don't get any more expansion on how this world and how the lore is connected and how it all works. I love these concepts and ideas so badly. I just wish that we got more information. The idea of two occult groups who are rivaling across different dimensions is so cool. I wish that was expanded upon even more. But sadly, Augustine's motives and our understanding of these two occult groups and how this interdimensional travel truly works, those details are never truly revealed to us. Once again, I am coming from the Supermassive side of this collaboration, so I'm sure that people who are familiar with the lore of Dead by Daylight would probably appreciate this story a lot more than I currently do. However, the fact that this is advertised as an origin story and there's still so many questions related to the lore and the origin of these occult groups and these characters and the entity itself makes me wonder if this is truly enough for all of you fans of Dead by Daylight. I would think that there should be so many more answers to all of this lore, and maybe I am wrong, so please let me know your thoughts down below, because if you did like it, did this answer all of your questions, would you have wanted more? Genuinely, I'm curious to know the point of view from Dead by Daylight fans, because online it does seem to be a bit of a mixed reaction right now, so let me know down below. A couple last things before we end up talking about the few theories that have come from these characters. There's a couple stupid questions that remain. Now, I know most games have tiny little details and plot holes that are always left a mystery, but with this game, it's not only an excessive amount of questions, but it's also just questions related to the overall lore that I would have really wanted to have resolved. There's stupid little things like, why didn't Chris get a piece of film tape if she survives in the 80s? How does Sam know for certain that Stan stole Robert's piece of film in this current timeline in 2024? How does he know that that happens in every single dimension? Why is it that Stan and Linda, despite them both being from this same dimension in 2024, why do they have such different accounts and understandings of these films' tapes, with Linda brushing them off as nothing and seemingly knowing next to nothing about what Stan is talking about, with these fans going into a rage of violence? Is there any chance that they could potentially be from different dimensions? Based on this conversation with Sam, if Linda in 2024 never broke her camera, how does her piece of film have Frank Stone's essence trapped within it, since it was recorded on her own camera and not Augustine's special magical camera? That is what causes Frank to awake and his spirit to get pulled from his death site and trapped in the film. With all of these questions running around, theories have been going rampant online, and I want to talk about two that I think work really, really nicely. Now, the first and most popular theory is the idea of Chris being a younger version of Augustine. Now, I have to admit that I really like this theory because to me it actually makes quite a lot of sense. The theory goes that Augustine summoned a younger version of herself that she then sort of groomed and manipulated in order to be obsessed with Frank Stone and to make sure that this film gets made in order to then trap his spirit and complete the ritual. This also would explain why Chris gets pulled into the Horologium once Frank Stone manifests in front of the group. The second he has started to get captured in the film, that is the exact moment that she gets taken away because she has completed her job. She successfully captured Frank Stone on camera, and now she is getting summoned back. Shout out to the Hidden Object Guru for clarifying the details of this theory for me. Now, while I really like this theory, I would like to also put a different twist on this idea that Chris could potentially be Augustine. If you look at Chris as a younger version of Augustine who is not currently being used as a pawn by the older version of Augustine, then I do think that there is the potential that she could eventually become Augustine in the older version that we see. And I think this is mainly due to the secret ending where Chris gets sent back into the 80s in this sort of weird time loop, with her potentially having to relive the same exact night over and over again. Her obsession with Frank Stone could easily develop into learning about the entity and then becoming obsessed with the entity to one day go on to worship the entity and join the Black Veil. Her getting pulled into the Horologium could also just be explained by the fact that she has the same DNA of Augustine. I think that alone could sort of mix up the Horologium and cause it to pull her from this timeline in this dimension when it didn't actually mean to. But that's just my sort of half-baked twist on this theory, so let me know your thoughts down below and what other evidence I missed. The second theory that I want to talk about is that Linda had already been through the trials a couple times before the events of 2024. I think this theory actually helps cover up a lot of the little plot holes that the game left for us. With the entity constantly consuming people's souls through the trials that we see in Dead by Daylight, the survivors go on to forget details of their past about their life the more trials they go through. So the fact that Linda is sort of sitting around at the campfire, comfortably waiting for Sam and Maddie, would also make sense since she's already been through this before. She knows the drill, and that is why she is the one sitting down at the campfire and not anyone else. Not to mention, this would go on to explain why her understanding of the film varies so much from Stan, and could also explain her lack of interest and intrigue into the lives of her past friends, such as Bonnie and Jaime, when she is talking to Maddie. Her general overall lack of connection and personability to Maddie could be seen as the entity having already started to consume her soul. It's not a perfect theory, but I do think that it could work, and it could definitely cover the writer's butt in relation to a lot of the questions that are left at the end. But putting the theories aside that I'm sure many of you guys have way more ideas and thoughts on, and different theories that I probably haven't heard yet, I just don't like what we got at the end of this game. It has sadly fallen into the ever-growing list of Supermassive games that could have been absolutely amazing, but just ended up being cool concepts with an okay game. And I'm really concerned about where Supermassive Games is going, and I think they are starting to have a major problem here. Despite my overall love for this company, I have to admit that I think they are slowly but surely losing fans at this steadily growing pace with every single game that they release. Speaking purely from my own experience over the years, I find myself growing tired of having the same complaints with their games. The games just constantly feel like they are rushed and not thought through. They feel a bit sloppy, and it's just really starting to feel like the company values quantity over quality at this point. And it's getting honestly sad and disappointing because once again, the concepts and the premise for these stories are so good and they just have so much wasted potential. The characters, as I said, aren't always perfect. They do tend to lean into the cheesier side of dialogue. However, when the character developments are done well, they are done insanely well. I will forever stand by the idea that Jason's character arc in House of Ashes is probably the best character development I've seen in a video game, especially in a game that is that short. So I know that this studio is capable of pulling off these great characters and these great stories. Every single one of Supermassive games could be an instant classic with actual meaningful, impactful stories, but they all seem to just boil down to games that could have been great, but end up okay. These games end up being played just for laughs rather than narrative games that have actual impact and meaning to them. Now, to play devil's advocate for just a minute here, maybe this is all on me. Maybe I keep going into these games looking for the next Until Dawn because, don't get me wrong, all of Supermassive games, they are fun to play through once, but it's only really enjoyable when you create a bit of distance from them. You have to be able to take a step back and go into it with this idea that it's not going to be perfect, and let's just kind of mess around and enjoy the cheesiness and glitches of these games. But the reality is, I don't want to just have fun. I want to go on the full extent and emotional journey that these characters and worlds create. But I guess especially after this experience with the casting of Frank Stone, I just have to accept the fact that with Supermassive games, I'm gonna have to go into them with a grain of salt and a bit of distance pre-established so that I don't get my hopes up every single time. Which is just so painful to say about a company that I really love their ideas and their work. But that's just what I'm gonna have to do from here on out. So with all of that, the casting of Frank Stone was a disappointing experience for me, but the actual game itself is okay despite the major pacing issues that I found it has. As long as you go in with the mindset of having that bit of distance and seeing it more for the cheesy elements than the serious ones, you'll have a pretty good time in your first run through, despite it maybe being a little bit confusing if you're like me and you don't know anything about the Dead by Daylight lore. So with that, everyone, if you liked this discussion, please make sure you hit that like button down below and leave your thoughts in the comment section. If you are coming from the Dead by Daylight side, please tell me, was this background information, was this origin story enough? Did it meet your expectations? Did it not? Let me know down below. And if you're coming from the Supermassive side like myself, were you as confused as I was? Were you thinking time travel or dimensional travel? Let me know in the comment section down below. Shameless plug here, but I have recently started a Twitch channel, so if you like watching live streams on Twitch instead of on YouTube, be sure to go check it out because this month in October, we are participating in Spooktober live streams. We are doing extra live streams this entire month as well as additional analysis videos. If that's something you're interested in, I will have my Twitch linked in the description box down below, and leave a little camera emoji in the comment section if you made it this far into the video. While you're down there, click subscribe to see more videos from me, and turn on notifications if you want to be notified whenever I post a new video. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I will see you future souls next time. Bye, guys!